Phil Harris and Josh Phegan come together in an incredible fortnightly podcast, Dream Big, Move Fast.
A progressive, contemporary conversation on what it takes to be a dynamic thinker, leader, and role model.
Backed with over 2 decades of friendship, trials and tribulations, they teach from real-world experience and what it takes to dream big, move fast.
The attitude we bring to things changes everything. Rick Rubin. Phil, what are your thoughts on this as a great quote to kick off today's episode?
Great quote, and particularly timely with some of the challenges that we're facing across the Australian property market at the moment. So it's a good one, Josh. Looking forward to having a chat.
Do you know who Rick Rubin is?
Actually, when the notes came through, I did do a quick Google and saw he was a creative music producer, I think.
Yeah. So, mate, we're talking Johnny Cash, Beastie Boys,
right,
Run DMC, Alicia Keys, Eminem, just some of the music groups he's actually produced.
That's a pretty good selection, pretty good panel.
So when you start to think about it, today's a great conversation and, Phil, how do we actually go to win in a changing market, in down markets, in volatile markets? And, you've been through a fair few cycles now, and this is a really important conversation. How do you work out what's actually happening in a market and what are the sorts of things you got to do as an agent to be ahead of that? Like, where are the early indicators to understand when a market's shifting?
Well, I think the early indicators, Josh, more so than ever, when a property market is flying, you are riding the coattails of momentum. So I think what's really critical in some of the marketplace that we're experiencing across Australia has never been more important time. You have to be well read and you have to be very well educated. And I would say there's some certain daily disciplines there, Josh, in terms of whatever that educational platform is for you, making sure you're across the Fin Review, making sure you're across a couple of other publications. But I think now more than ever, you have to be absolutely armed with the latest data about facts in your marketplace. And that's not a weekly occurrence. That's a daily discipline that needs to become part of your daily routine.
One of the big things that I've been doing in a lot of conferences is I've just been drawing up a little T chart. And on one side I write down, this is what we know. And the other side I write down, but this is what we're doing. And I think it's a really good way to present it to a seller and a really good way to even present it to your sales team. And the first key thing is to say, okay, great, these are the things that we know. So in Australia so far this year, we've seen 3 interest rate increases, a 7.5% reduction in borrowing capacity, an increase in servicing costs, changes to negative gearing, capital gains tax, self-managed super funds can't borrow to buy residential property. Also, too, we've seen AML come in, a really big sentiment shift across the country. And foundationally, increases in petrol prices, electricity prices, the cost of living is the major crisis. And we've seen a world that's incredibly distracted in an attention economy where people are buying attention, better known as social media streams. So therefore, information and unease and anxiety is probably at peak states. And if you now think about it, I was having a quick look at it the other day, the stats are saying 141 notifications a day, which means that the average Australian consumer is at 53,000 interruptions per year. And if you go and have a quick look at that, we no longer have more than a 10-minute window of attention before we get another interruption.
Yeah, when you take that into consideration as well as all the other data points you just mentioned, Josh, it's not an incredibly positive situation. If you look at it from that angle, but then I would say if you relay it back to a different perspective, there are still lots of people out there that need to buy a house. There are lots of people that need to sell a house, and there are lots of people that need to rent a house. So it all comes back to that angle of how we're going to view this.
So on the right-hand side, but this is what we're doing. So we're doing lots of really good quality buyer appointments. This is the best market we've ever seen for upgraders. We're ringing buyers and potential sellers and market appraisals and past clients that we know that are in the price range before and getting them to buy in the price range above because the changeover costs are the least they've ever been. We now know that this is a really good market for first home buyers because there'll be no competition from investors trying to buy established residential property. You now need to have properties that are actually known as a new property marked that way on all of your marketing. So an investor knows that literally the capital gains discount also to the negative gearing would be appropriate. And you need to really shift expectations about understanding that ultimately we're here for quite some period of time before we're actually going to start to see price growth in the major capitals in both Melbourne and Sydney.
Josh, in terms of market dynamics, like we're seeing multiple changes in markets over the years, both you and I, we've been doing it for over 20 years now.
Yeah.
How would you explain the difference in the challenges of this market, say, versus us coming off the back of GFC in 2008? What are the differences that you're seeing?
We probably didn't know what was happening in 2008. Like respectfully, we were just still trying to learn our listing presentations and we're running an auction today. Will this one sell? Like, we were just as surprised as the sellers when it sold. Yeah. But I think that so there is also too that beautiful air of just like not knowing. And so you just get on and you put in really good quality work and effort. And if I think about the very early days of both of our careers, I think that we just threw effort at the table more than anything, and later on skill came. And I think that this is interesting because, you just got to start to think that like we live in a world which is like really anxious. And you got to be prepared to go to like remove that level of anxiety. So, one of the things that you have said to me, which I've experimented with, is about like taking all social media off my mobile device and only actually having it available on an iPad at home. And I found an app called Beeper, which still allowed the direct messaging function. So someone could still send me a DM and I could still respond. And that was my greatest fear, is that I'd have a customer who'd go, oh, where can I get a copy of that? Or how do I get a ticket to this? And me not respond to that. So I've actually been able to do that. But geez, the difference in that, and I'm almost at the point of taking email off my phone as well. And the difference about what it does to the level of calmness is absolutely phenomenal. And so I just think that like,
is this the challenge, Josh? Because there are so many distractions, yet are we getting too involved and too well-read and too over-analysing the CGD, the negative gearing?
I think that consumers
petrol prices versus just there's a person who wants to buy, go show them property,
yeah,
and go build a relationship with your vendor,
yeah,
and have a level of trust so that you can bring it together. Have we actually overcomplicated it now?
I think that ultimately the biggest problem is that the consumer's in a position of hesitation, doesn't know what to do. So this is where great salesmanship, the ability to be able to metaphorically take you by the hand and lead you towards this particular outcome is what you should be doing now, is absolutely the greatest skill of all time. And, when you start to think about it, like the evolution of AI, and you and I were talking a little bit about that today, is it like, the punch that it's going to give? And I asked you a really pertinent question, that, when you start to think about technology, as more technology has shown up in your life, have you done more or less work? And the reality of it is that we've done more work and we've never been busier.
Far more.
And so I don't think that AI is going to change anything like that. I just think that ultimately we're just going to have more work to do, but it's going to be potentially different types of work, compared to what we currently do today. So this is interesting because I think that, like Phil, how many times have you ever been in a sales meeting where someone says, okay, great, let's go to the next agenda item, the forecast, where someone actually gives you a proper forecast to a sales team about this is what's currently going in the market and this is what we need to do to adapt. Is that just missing from the sales meeting agenda in sales meetings across the country?
Well, I don't think we've really had that conversation for the last 5 years, probably, Josh.
Yeah.
But it's one that should definitely be there. Critical conversation every week now.
Because if you're like saying to them, hey, by the way, guys, this is, the changes is this and that, then this is what we're going to go to do next. So BDMs around the country are worried because sales teams are not going to be generating their leads. So all of a sudden, BDMs are going to find different ways, which is takeovers and, working some of the properties that they might have quoted on in the past and getting their existing landlords to give the balance of their portfolio to them. Like, there's going to be different strategies and potentially acquisitions can be.
And particularly right now, I don't think the forecast, you're not really forecasting for months out. I think the scoreboard is changing almost day by day at the moment. That's how closely connected you need to be with strategy.
And so that's the conversation, that literally the speed of information, which has been facilitated through mobiles and social, is changing the way that consumers are acting and behaving. So therefore, markets are erratic and maybe 7 to 8 year property cycles are completely gone. And so this is actually a really important part, that like ultimately most of this is mood or sentiment driven. Most of this is driven by media and most of this is driven by government policy. So if you go to think about those things, we're now in a position that we're worried about what's happening, hundreds of kilometres away in the Middle East, because we're worried about whether or not we're going to get petrol to Australia and all of those sorts of things that are going to go on. And that's driven phenomenal uptake of electric cars and XYZ, as a part of that conversation. Like, these are unbelievable things, like I'm going to say, when you start to think about what consumers are doing. So when you look at that, I think that like strategy really matters. But I have this foundational idea that in any market, the best thing to do is stay listing, but list the type of properties that that are going to go and sell. So if they're, whatever the average sale price is, if you kind of stick 10% either side of that average sale price and you have like 80% of your listings in that sweet spot, you will still do incredibly well.
I think that's really wise words. I think it's back to the traditional things that made us both successful in our careers, Josh, which is having great relationships with people, but starting to look at your work life from daily activity, not necessarily based on outcomes. So if you actually put the distractions aside, as you said, things like email, things like Instagram and all those sort of things, if there's a certain amount of daily activity that needs to be done, if you've got strong relationships, then there's still plenty of success that can be had.
And really, I think that like it's about now learning, Phil, where probably the majority of our careers started was about bridging the gap between a buyer and a seller. I pretty confidently would say that, for a large percentage of my career, like we had a situation that I don't think that many properties ever sold at what the original owner's asking price was. And that wasn't because we overpriced them. We just didn't have the level of demand in a regional marketplace like you had in cities to have robust auction environments. And I think that, from that point of view, like we were negotiating over $5,000 or $10,000 as to whether or not a transaction came together. And most of the time the vendor would want to take that off your fee, that $5,000 or $10,000, but it represented maybe, 25 or even 50% of the fee, depending on the price range at the time, back in the $300,000 average sale price days. But just goes to show you that, you got to know that, you got to negotiate in percentages. You need to know, what did the owner actually pay for the property? Are they actually selling for a profit? What if they are selling at a loss? Why would they sell that particular asset? How do you actually help the buyer to pay an extra $5, $10, $15, or $20 or $50,000? What does that look like in terms of a weekly repayment? What are we doing to try to make sure that we can bridge the gap? Can we say, okay, great, go and put your money into the bank account and get 5% on a fixed term deposit? So we definitely have got the money for you. But learning how to position information in a way that people can accept it. 2 offers on a property at the same time. So one offer makes the other offer look like it's actually great money. So that way you can present information in context so that people can go to make some better quality decisions. Phil, is that where it's at, where the skill growth has actually got to be more aligned into how you work with both a buyer and a seller to make them feel both really confident in a transaction?
I think you're 100% spot on, Josh. And I think that we're looking at the current environment as if it's not normal and how hard it is. But the reality is probably the 5 years that we've all just experienced, Josh, that's been the abnormality, not the normal. And so I think that strategy is 100% back on the table, exactly what you said, particularly on the buyer side of things. All of those things that we used to do, as you said, not presenting any offers in isolation, creating competitive environments, a lot more one-on-one buyer show-throughs, understanding product knowledge to a whole new level. Like this kind of attitude that we've been able to get away with the last 5 years of just showing somebody through a property with an A4 brochure and a floor plan on the back and not knowing all the fixtures and all the fittings and not knowing what property sold down the road and what the one across the street sold for and also who bought it and who the underbidder was and why they paid that. All of these things that we've now been able to neglect, I would say, unfortunately for a lot of people, but probably fortunately for the best agents across the country, I think that the best agents, they've got an opportunity to take market share that they haven't been able to take over the last 5 years, because the first time in the last 5 years, there's now a far greater value on who vendors choose to sell their home.
And I'm going to say something to you that I think the majority of properties in Australia are currently being sold below replacement cost. So with the fueling costs in relation to PVC piping, concrete, building costs, labour costs, all of the above, you can't actually build them for what we're currently selling them for.
Yep.
And so I'm going to say, great inequalities, but this is really about, knowing what's required to dominate and to win. And if I had have rang you in 2021 and I said, Phil, I know that we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic, but can you just really enjoy this because this is going to be one of the best sales years of your career? You would have told me I was crazy, because you're upset that you weren't allowed to go more than 5Ks and you're in a lockdown and, all of those things. Does that kind of make sense? So even when it's good, I still don't see people enjoy it. And even when it's bad, they wish that it was back good, but when it was good, they had all the problems with capacity of how do I handle all of these hundreds of buyers versus how can I just get somebody who wants to answer my call?
I think that starts to dig into the human element, the challenge of being human, isn't it, Josh? We complain when it's good, we complain when it's not good, we complain when it's okay. So
do you remember the day that literally we ticked over from 99 to 100 sales a month at Harris?
I can't remember the day vividly, but
I was there.
I thought it was going to be, all my dreams come true, and then you move forward, right?
But I was there that day, and I remember it changing on the board, and you're like, man, look at that. We've just done 100. And now you look at that, and you can have some incredible months of 450 in a month.
Yeah.
Do you just realize how far you've come?
Yeah, definitely. I think.
Does it feel better?
I don't know if it necessarily feels better. I'm probably as guilty as anybody is looking for kind of the next climb. But no, I am definitely incredibly grateful, and
which is exactly right.
Yeah,
be grateful for what you've got. But here's the key thing. You know what? Unfortunately, we've had some terrible atrocities on Sydney beaches recently with shark activity, and you look at the conditions and then you make adjustments. like I'm not going into the ocean. I'm not a confident swimmer given that environment. I'm happy to go into an ocean pool, but probably not into the beach right now, or I'd wait, if that kind of makes sense. So what I'm saying to people is that ultimately you got to realize you need to know what the forecast is, and then you need to adjust your behavior to make sure that you can win in the conditions of the day. Principle, is this an effort or a skills error? What do you reckon of that as a principle? Just to think that ultimately it's either effort or skill, and what is it that you're not putting in to make sure that you win?
It seems like a quote that I almost speak regularly to my kids about, this one, Josh. Like I'm very lenient with my children around, if we haven't got the skills, we can work on that. But I lack tolerance for lack of effort.
Yes.
Yeah, I can handle someone not having a skill. Like we can work on that. We can build that. So I do actually love the quote. Like to me, not trying or lack of effort is unacceptable.
Yes.
But the skills, we can work on those. We can get them right.
And that's a great little conversation to go and have, right? So about time they get out there and, become the next Leighton Hewitt, hey?
Feeling good and ready for more? Thanks for joining us
On Dream Big,
Move Fast.